Hello everyone, and welcome to your 72nd Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about NSGridView on macOS. So NSGridView was introduced in 10.12, and its general purpose is to lay out views in a two-dimensional array of content. So if, for example, you have an example where you have content that is in discrete columns and discrete rows, then NSGridView might be a good application in this scenario. And what it allows you to avoid is it allows you to avoid changing constraints between different views or having stacked views that are next to each other and trying to align those correctly. NSGridView does a lot to align your content in the way you might expect. And one of the suggested ways of using NSGridView is actually for a preference pane type scenario. So I don't actually know whether they use NSGridView in this case, but I know that you probably could recreate the whole thing using NSGridView. And the nice thing about this is that you never really have to touch any constraints code, which can be rather daunting if you either have to do it in code, would be very difficult, or if you have to do it in a nib file, you have a lot of constraints that you have to deal with, and it just is rather complicated, where NSGridView can simplify this a little bit. So here you can see an example where there's a discrete sort of column and row paradigm. So on the left we have a column. On the right here we can think of this as another column. And then you can think of every single one of these different rows as different content. So every one of these, right, is its own sort of content. And there's also the ability to merge across multiple columns. So that's also perhaps what they're doing in this case as well, is spanning the separator across a few columns. So that's sort of an idea of how you could use NSGridView, but there are many ways that you could use it that are not really part of just a preference pane example. So how can we create things in NSGridView? Well, we can either do it in code, or there is a nib way to do it as well. And I actually would highly suggest the nib example because it's way easier than code. I'll show you the nib example at the end, but it's very easy to understand how the nib case works. But I do want to show you some of the APIs that are available to you via code. And you might still want to use these things even if you have the nib in place. So let's go ahead and create some content here. So I already have some pre-made content. If I go ahead and use this. And so if I go ahead and run, we can see that my grid view would look something like this. So what have I constructed here? Well, we have a NSGridView, and the initializer for this particular initializer of NSGridView takes a two-dimensional array of views. So it's an array of views. And the structure for that is that the outside array is representing the rows. So this would be one row, this would be another row, and it kind of reads as it's going to lay out, which is a nice benefit of that. And if I want, I can also look inside here, which would represent my rows. So this would be the first item in the row, and this would be the second item in the row. And we can see that if I look at the example once again. Now, if I look at sort of how system preferences works, we note that there's a few things that are a little off. One is that the content on the left is always basically it's on the right side, right? Or it is trailing. And the way we can change this is we can actually change this on various levels. So we could change this on a grid level, we could change this on a row level, we could change this on a column level, and all of these kind of inherit their own things, which is interesting. But basically, you kind of want to start with the lowest common denominator of what you're dealing with. So in this particular case, we want basically the entire column to be right aligned, essentially. So to do this, we can talk to the grid, we can ask for a column at a particular index. In this case, it's the first column, so index 0. And we can change the X placement. And there's an enum that represents different ways that you could place the item. And we want to place it on the trailing edge. And so now if I go ahead and rerun this, we should be able to see that now it looks a little more like our example. So the entire grid itself has specified that it's going to be on the leading edge, but when we specify the sort of closer to the individual cell level, in this case we're getting more specific with the column, we can change the columns trailing space as well. Okay, so how would we now, let's say if I'm going back to this example, you can see that now there's a bunch of other radio buttons that are below it, but there's no content on the left. And how would we represent that? Well, we could go ahead and make an NS button, and we'll make a new radio button. And the content that we want when scrolling, and I'm not going to set up any of the actions in this tutorial because it's not really necessary. And then I'm going to go ahead and also put in the other one, which is always. Always, I think I can spell. And let's go ahead and just try running this to see what we would get out of this result. And as you can see, the content is actually going to be put in the first column. And this is just by design how this initializer works, in that it's just going to put the content in whatever first column is available. But we don't really want that. We actually want to push it into the second column. And we can do this by representing an empty space. So the way we can do this is we can access the individual cell level. And just to give you an idea of how this API is structured, I'm going to look at the API itself. And so NSGridView has kind of its own specification of individual columns, rows, and cells. So there is an NSGrid row, an NSGrid column, and NSGrid cell are all different entities that you can access to customize how they might appear. And I'm not going to waste all my time trying to go through all the different things that are on these APIs, but feel free to look at all of them yourself, and we'll touch on a few more as we go through this. But the idea is we want to be able to space out this content so that it's going to be on the next column. And to do this, we can access NSGrid cell, and there is a idea of an empty content view. And so this is a way that you can tell the grid view that, hey, we're going to actually not have content here. Please push the content to the next spot in the row. And so if I go ahead and run this, we can see that the content will now be appropriately moved to this spot. All right, so now that we have that, you might note that, well, the spacing is all very close together. How could we change that kind of thing? Well, we have a few different options. We can either look at this row and we could change the spacing on the bottom, or we could look at this row, change the spacing on the top, or we could add a new row altogether. It's kind of up to you, but we're going to go with the example of just adding space to the top of this content here. So again, we can do a similar thing like we did when we were accessing the column, but this time I'm going to access the row. So I'm going to ask for the row, and it's the row at 0, 1, 2, 3. And we can ask for top padding, and we can just specify something that we want. So let's just say that we want an extra 10 for top padding, and let's go ahead and run that. And we can see that there is now a little bit of padding between the always button and the jump to next page button as well. So you can see how this is kind of getting structured. Now, the very last thing that I want to show in code is how we can combine cells together. So an example of this is this big separator that crosses the barrier here. And we need some way to tell the grid view that we want to span the entire distance of across these two columns. So what we're going to do is first create our separator, and to create a separator we create a little box, and I'm going to make a separator and this box, and we're going to set the box type to be a separator. And now I can put this guy at the bottom just for my example here. So let's throw in our separator, and that's all I'm going to say. So if I just did this, you probably can infer what's going to happen. I need my comma there. So if I just had my separator, it's only going to put the separator at the position that's in this first row here. And that's not really what we want, right? We want the separators to span the entire grid view. So the way we can do this is we can access that particular row. So I'm actually going to get a reference to this row, and I'll call it my separator row. And on this particular thing, we can just say grid.row, row, get the index is 4. and then we can alter it. So first we're going to tell it that we want to merge the cells in this row. So we can say merge the cells, and we just specify all the cells that we want to merge and arrange. So in this example here, we want to basically just merge there's only 2 columns, so we want the length to be 2 columns in our range, right? Location is where we start, and then length is the number of items after where we start. So that'll merge the cells together. Let's go a little bit further though, where we're gonna add some top and bottom spacing to this. So we can add some top spacing. Let's maybe say, I'm not sure what's appropriate, but we can play around with it if we really wanted to. Let's just give it some 16 on top and bottom, and let's test it out. So we'll go ahead and run it again. And you can see here we've got a separator now. You can see there's some nice spacing, and it spans the entire width of the grid view. So that's a pretty simple example of how we could get what we want to have happen in our grid view. The last thing that I want to note is that there is a concept of how the items across the row are aligned. And so if I look at the API on NSGridView, I just want to dive into this briefly because I think it's kind of important. So there is the concept of row alignment. And if I look at the items that we have here, we can actually align items by their first baseline. And by default, this is not how this occurs. So the reason we would want to do first baseline is if we had a button and a text field. So let's go ahead and do a quick example of that, where I'm going to just use, let me just copy some of this a bit. And I'm going to say button. And my normal button on this side, I'm just going to make it a title. Oops. Title. Oh, why do I not keep selecting the wrong thing? Title. And we'll also just say button. Nil. Nil. Okay. And I just want to show you what the default will look like and why it's wrong. So if I zoom into this a little bit, you can see that the alignment between the text of this button and the text of the label is not correct. And usually this is why we would want to align our buttons with the text fields to be first baseline aligned. That's basically if you drew an imaginary line along the bottom of your text field, it's basically the first baseline that we would want to align across. And the way we can fix this is we actually just tell our grid that we want all of our row alignments to be on a first baseline basis. So I can go ahead and run this. And if I see the difference now, I can zoom in and we can see that the text on the button now aligns with the text on the label. So these are things that NSGridView gives you a lot for free that you don't have to deal with in the constraints directly. All right, the very last thing I want to show is how we could do this using a nib file, and I find this to be a way easier approach. As you can see, the code for setting up a lot of these things, and we haven't really made it that far either. So this code alone is, relatively complicated to get what you want. There's a lot of issues around getting the wrong index, right? So if you, for example, change the index of something and, put something higher up in the grid, now all your indexes are out of, they're not matching the right items anymore. And you got a lot of, weird things like that. So there is the ability to add a grid view into your project. And the nice thing about this is that you can just kind of fill up the items you want. So if I want a label, I can just drag in a label and it'll automatically fill the content to that size. I can add in a radio button if I want. Oop, not sure why that didn't add. Let's try it again. Radio button. There we go. And you can change the title, right? And it'll just kind of adjust like that. If I want to adjust any of the properties of this, we can go to the attributes inspector on the right, and there's a bunch of things we can change. So there's explicit ways of changing, for example, the grid row, which is what I have selected right now. And you can either do that in the little ruler or the attributes inspector, and there's various properties that you can change. One thing is that you can select, for example, the grid itself, and if you select the grid itself, you'll get all the grid properties. You can select the columns, you can select the rows, you can select individual cells, and you can change pretty much any of the attributes you would want to change about these individual items right in the attributes inspector. So this is a very nice approach as well, and I would probably suggest going this way. You can even merge the cells. So if you right click on this item, and I think maybe if I just select the whole row, maybe not. I think I might need actual content to put it in. So let me just demonstrate that. Let's put in a button in this guy, and there is a way to do this. There we go. So I guess I have to select the individual cells to do that, which I guess makes sense when I think about it, because you can merge whatever cells you wanted. So select the cells you want, and then you can hit on this little arrow and you can hit merge cells. And now your button will span the entire section, and it's all just an individual cell for that row. So anyway, I hope that helps you with, designing your user interfaces for macOS. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave your questions in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in a future tutorial. See you then.